Chapter 5. On Entering and Leaving the Presidency. It is a very old saying that you can never tell what you can do until you try. The more I see of life, the more I am convinced of the wisdom of that observation. Surprisingly few men are lacking in capacity, but they fail because they are lacking in application. Either they never learn how to work, or having learned, they are too indolent to apply themselves with the seriousness and the attention that is necessary to solve important problems. Any reward that is worth having only comes to the industrious. The success which is made in any walk of life is measured almost exactly by the amount of hard work that is put into it. It has undoubtedly been the lot of every native boy of the United States to be told that he will someday be president. Nearly every young man who happens to be elected a member of his state legislature is pointed to by his friends and his local newspapers as on the way to the White House. My own experience in this respect did not differ from that of others, but I never took such suggestions seriously, as I was convinced in my own mind that I was not qualified to fill the exalted office of president. I had not changed this opinion after the November elections of 1919. When I was chosen governor of Massachusetts for a second term by a majority which had only been exceeded in 1896. When I began to be seriously mentioned by some of my friends at that time as the Republican candidate for president, it became apparent that there were many others who shared the same opinion as to my fitness which I had so long entertained. But the coming National Convention, acting in accordance with an unchangeable determination, took my destiny into its own hands, and nominated me for vice president. Had I been chosen for the first place, I could have accepted it only with a great deal of trepidation, but when the events of August 1923 bestowed upon me the presidential office, I felt at once that power had been given me to administer it. This was not any feeling of exclusiveness. While I felt qualified to serve, I was also well aware that there were many others who were better qualified. It would be my province to get the benefit of their opinions and advice. It is a great advantage to a president, and a major source of safety to the country, for him to know that he is not a great man. When a man begins to feel that he is the only one who can lead in this republic, he is guilty of treason to the spirit of our institutions. On the night of August 2nd, 1923, I was awakened by my father coming up the stairs, calling my name. I noticed that his voice trembled. As the only times I had ever observed that before were when death had visited our family, I knew that something of the gravest nature had occurred. His emotion was partly due to the knowledge that a man whom he had met and liked was gone, partly to the feeling that must possess all of our citizens when the life of their president is taken from them. But he must have been moved also by the thought of the many sacrifices he had made to place me where I was, the 25-mile drive in storms and in zero weather over our mountain roads to carry me to the academy, and all the tenderness and care he had lavished upon me in the 38 years since the death of my mother, in the hope that I might sometime rise to a position of importance, which he now saw realized. He had been the first to address me as President of the United States. It was the culmination of the lifelong desire of a father for the success of his son. He placed in my hands an official report and told me that President Harding had just passed away. My wife and I at once dressed. Before leaving the room, I knelt down, and with the same prayer with which I have since approached the altar of the church, I asked God to bless the American people and to give me power to serve them. My first thought was to express my sympathy for those who had been bereaved, and after that was done, to attempt to reassure the country with the knowledge that I proposed no sweeping displacement of the men then in office, and that there were to be no violent changes in the administration of affairs. As soon as I had dispatched a telegram to Mrs. Harding, I therefore issued a short public statement declaratory of that purpose. Meantime, I had been examining the Constitution to determine what might be necessary for qualifying by taking the oath of office. It is not clear that any additional oath is required beyond what is taken by the Vice President when he is sworn into office. It is the same form as that taken by the President. Having found this form in the Constitution, I had it set up on the typewriter, and the oath was administered by my father in his capacity as a notary public, an office he had held for a great many years. The oath was taken in what we always called the sitting room, by the light of the kerosene lamp, which was the most modern form of lighting that had then reached the neighborhood. The Bible which had belonged to my mother lay on the table at my hand. It was not officially used, as it is not the practice in Vermont or Massachusetts to use a Bible in connection with the administration of an oath. Besides my father and myself, there were present my wife, Senator Dale, who happened to be stopping a few miles away, my stenographer, and my chauffeur. The picture of this scene has been painted with historical accuracy by an artist named Keller, who went to Plymouth for that purpose. Although the likenesses are not good, everything in relation to the painting is correct. Where succession to the highest office in the land is by inheritance or appointment, no doubt there have been kings who have participated in the induction of their sons into their office, but in republics where the succession comes by an election, I do not know of any other case in history where a father has administered to his son the qualifying oath of office, which made him the chief magistrate of a nation. It seemed a simple and natural thing to do at the time, but I could now realize something of the dramatic force of the event. This room was one which was already filled with sacred memories for me. In it my sister and my stepmother passed their last hours. It was associated with my boyhood recollections of my own mother, who sat and reclined there during her long invalid years, though she passed away in an adjoining room where my father was to follow her within 3 years from this eventful night. When I started for Washington that morning, I turned aside from the main road to make a short devotional visit to the grave of my mother. It had been a comfort to me during my boyhood, when I was troubled, to be near her last resting place, even in the dead of night. Some way that morning she seemed very near to me. A telegram was sent to my pastor, Dr. Jason Noble Pierce, to meet me on my arrival at Washington that evening, which he did. I found the cabinet mostly scattered. Some members had been with the late president, and some were in Europe. The Secretary of State, Mr. Hughes, and myself at once began the preparation of plans for the funeral. I issued the usual proclamation. The Washington services were held in the rotunda of the Capitol, followed by a simple service and interment at Marion, Ohio, which I attended with the cabinet and a large number of officers of the government. The nation was grief-stricken. Especially noticeable was the deep sympathy everyone felt for Mrs. Harding. Through all this distressing period, her bearing won universal commendation. Her attitude of sympathy and affections towards Mrs. Coolidge and myself was an especial consolation to us. The first Sunday after reaching Washington, we attended services, as we were accustomed to do, at the First Congregational Church. Although I had been rather constant in my attendance, I had never joined the church. While there had been religious services, there was no organized church society near my boyhood home. Among other things, I had some fear as to my ability to set that example which I always felt ought to denote the life of a church member. I am inclined to think now that this was a counsel of darkness. This first service happened to come on Communion Day. Our pastor, Dr. Pierce, occupied the pulpit, and, as he can under the practices of the Congregational Church, and always does, because of his own very tolerant attitude, he invited all those who believed in the Christian faith, whether church members or not, to join in partaking of the communion. For the first time I accepted this invitation, which I later learned he had observed, and in a few days, without any intimation to me that it was to be done, considering this to be a sufficient public profession of my faith, the church voted me into its membership. This declaration of their belief in me was a great satisfaction. Had I been approached in the usual way to join the church after I became president, I should have feared that such action might appear to be opposed, and should have hesitated to accept. From what might have been a misguided conception, I was thus saved by some influence which I had not anticipated. But if I had not voluntarily gone to church and partaken of communion, this blessing would not have come to me. Fate bestows its rewards on those who put themselves in the proper attitude to receive them. During my service in Washington, I had seen a large amount of government business. Peace had been made with the Central Powers, the tariff revised, the budget system adopted, taxation reduced, large payments made on the national debt, the Veterans Bureau organized, important farm legislation passed, public expenditures greatly decreased, the differences with Colombia of 20 years standing composed, and the Washington Conference had reached an epoch-making agreement for the practical limitation of naval armaments. It would be difficult to find 2 years of peacetime history in all the record of our republic that were marked with more important and far-reaching accomplishments. From my position as President of the Senate, and in my attendance upon the sessions of the Cabinet, I thus came into possession of a very wide knowledge of the details of the government. In spite of the remarkable record which had already been made, much remained to be done. While anything that relates to the functions of the government is of enormous interest to me, its economic relations have always had a particular fascination for me. Though these are necessarily predicated on order and peace, yet our people are so thoroughly law-abiding, and our foreign relations are so happy, that the problem of government action, which is to carry its benefits into the homes of all the people, becomes almost entirely confined to the realm of economics. My personal experience with business had been such as comes to a country lawyer. My official experience with government business had been of a wide range. As mayor, I had charge of the financial affairs of the city of Northampton. As lieutenant governor, I was chairman of the Committee on Finance of the Governor's Council, which had to authorize every cent of the expenditures of the Commonwealth before they could be made. As governor, I was chargeable with responsibility both for appropriations and for expenditures. My fundamental idea of both private and public business came first from my father. He had the strong New England trait of great repugnance at seeing anything wasted. He was a generous and charitable man, but he regarded waste as a moral wrong. Wealth comes from industry and from the hard experience of human toil. To dissipate it in waste and extravagance is disloyalty to humanity. This is by no means a doctrine of parsimony. Both men and nations should live in accordance with their means and devote their substance not only to productive industry, but to the creation of the various forms of beauty and the pursuit of culture which gives adornments to the arts of life. When I became president, it was perfectly apparent that the key by which the way could be opened to national progress was constructive economy. Only by the use of that policy could the high rates of taxation, which were retarding our development and prosperity, be diminished, and the enormous burden of our public debt be reduced. Without impairing the efficient operation of all the functions of the government, I have steadily and without ceasing pressed on in that direction. This policy has encouraged enterprise, made possible the highest rate of wages which has ever existed, returned large profits, brought to the homes of the people the greatest economic benefits they ever enjoyed, and given to the country as a whole an unexampled era of prosperity. This well-being of my country has given me the chief satisfaction of my administration. One of my most pleasant memories will be the friendly relations which I have always had with the representatives of the press in Washington. I shall always remember that at the conclusion of the first regular conference I held with them at the White House office, they broke into hearty applause. I suppose that in answering their questions I had been fortunate enough to tell them what they wanted to know in such a way that they could make use of it. While there have been newspapers which supported me, of course there have been others which opposed me, but they have usually been fair. I shall always consider it the highest tribute to my administration that the opposition have based so little of their criticism on what I have really said and done. I have often said that there was no cause for feeling disturbed at being misrepresented in the press. It would be only when they began to say things detrimental to me which were true that I should feel alarm. Perhaps one of the reasons I have been a target for so little abuse is because I have tried to refrain from abusing other people. The words of the President have enormous weight and ought not to be used indiscriminately. It would be exceedingly easy to set the country all by the ears and foment hatreds and jealousies, which, by destroying faith and confidence, would help nobody and harm everybody. The end would be the destruction of all progress. Notwithstanding the broad general knowledge which I had of the government, when I reached Washington I found it necessary to make an extensive survey of the various departments to acquaint myself with details. This work had to be done intensively from the 1st of August to the middle of November, in order to have the background and knowledge which would enable me to discuss the state of the Union in my first message to the Congress. Although meantime I was pressed with invitations to make speeches, I did not accept any of them. The country was in mourning, and I felt it more appropriate to make my first declaration in my message to the Congress. Of course, I opened the Red Cross Convention in October, which was an official function for me as its president. I was especially fortunate in securing C. Bascom Slimp as my secretary, who had been a member of the House for many years and had a wide acquaintance with public men and the workings of legislative machinery. His advice was most helpful. I had already served with all the members of the cabinet, which perhaps was one reason I found them so sympathetic. Among its membership were men of great ability, who have served their country with a capacity which I do not believe was ever exceeded by any former cabinet officers. A large amount was learned from George Harvey, ambassador to England, concerning the European situation. He not only had a special aptitude for gathering and digesting information of that nature, but had been located at London for 2 years, where most of it centered. It has been my policy to seek information and advice wherever I could find it. I have never relied on any particular person to be my unofficial adviser. I have let the merits of each case and the soundness of all advice speak for themselves. My counselors have been those provided by the Constitution and the law. I called in a great many people from all the different walks of life over the country. Among the first to come voluntarily were the veteran president and the secretary of the American Federation of Labor, Mr. Gompers and Mr. Morrison. They brought a formal resolution expressive of personal regard for me and assurance of loyal support for the government. Farm organizations and businessmen, publishers, educators, and many others all had to be consulted. Due largely to this careful preparation, my message was well received. No other public utterance of mine had been given greater approbation. Most of the praise was sincere, but there were some quarters in the opposing party where it was thought it would be good strategy to encourage my party to nominate me, thinking that it would be easy to accomplish my defeat. I do not know whether their judgment was wrong or whether they overdid the operation, so that when they stopped speaking in my praise, they found they could not change the opinion of the people which they had helped to create. I have seen a great many attempts at political strategy in my day, and elaborate plans made to encompass the destruction of this or that public man. I cannot now think of any that did not react with overwhelming force upon the perpetrators, sometimes destroying them and sometimes giving their proposed victim an opportunity to demonstrate his courage, strength, and soundness, which increased his standing with the people and raised him to higher office. There is only one form of political strategy in which I have any confidence, and that is to try to do the right thing and sometimes be able to succeed. Many people at once began to speak about nominating me to lead my party in the next campaign. I did not take any position in relation to their efforts. Unless the nomination came to me in a natural way, rather than as the result of an artificial campaign, I did not feel it would be of any value. The people ought to make their choice on a great question of that kind without the influence that could be exerted by a president in office. After the favorable reception which was given to my message, I stated at the gridiron dinner that I should be willing to be a candidate. The convention nominated me the next June by a vote which was practically unanimous. With the exception of the occasion of my notification, I did not attend any partisan meetings or make any purely political speeches during the campaign. I spoke several times at the dedication of a monument, the observance of the anniversary of an historic event, at a meeting of some commercial body, or before some religious gathering. The campaign was magnificently managed by William M. Butler, and as it progressed, the final result became more and more apparent. My own participation was delayed by the death of my son Calvin, which occurred on the 7th of July. He was a boy of much promise, proficient in his studies, with a scholarly mind, who had just turned 16. He had a remarkable insight into these things. The day I became president, he had just started to work in a tobacco field. When one of his fellow laborers said to him, "If my father was president, I would not work in a tobacco field," Calvin replied, "If my father were your father, you would." After he was gone, someone sent us a letter he had written about the same time to a young man who had congratulated him on being the first boy in the land. To this he had replied that he had done nothing, and so did not merit the title, which should go to some boy who had distinguished himself through his own actions. We do not know what might have happened to him under other circumstances, but if I had not been president, he would not have raised a blister on his toe, which resulted in blood poisoning playing lawn tennis in the South grounds. In his suffering he was asking me to make him well. I could not. When he went, the power and the glory of the presidency went with him. The ways of Providence are often beyond our understanding. It seemed to me that the world had need of the work that it was probable he could do. I do not know why such a price was exacted for occupying the White House. Sustained by the great outpouring of sympathy from all over the nation, my wife and I bowed to the supreme will, and with such courage as we had, went on in the discharge of our duties. In less than 2 years my father followed him. At his advanced age he had overtaxed his strength, receiving the thousands of visitors who went to my old home at Plymouth. It was all a great satisfaction to him, and he would not have had it otherwise. When I was there and visitors were kept from the house for a short period, he would be really distressed in the thought that they could not see all they wished, and he would go out where they were himself and mingle among them. I knew for some weeks that he was passing his last days. I sent to bring him to Washington, but he clung to his old home. It was a sore trial not to be able to be with him, but I had to leave him where he most wished to be. When his doctors advised me that he could survive only a short time, I started to visit him. but he sank to rest while I was on my way. For my personal contact with him during his last months, I had to resort to the poor substitute of the telephone. When I reached home, he was gone. It costs a great deal to be president.